Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, the New Look question time kicks off in Canberra and already the rules have been broken. The government loses their first vote on the floor of Parliament, the first time that has happened in nearly 70 years, and traditional owners take on Tony Abbott over his plan to scrap Queensland's Wild Rivers legislation. Our panel tonight, ABC Online's religion and ethics editor Scott Stevens, former president of the Victorian Young Liberals and writer for The Spectator, James Paterson, and in Canberra, ABC Online's chief political writer, Annabel Crabb. This afternoon, we saw the first question time under the new parliamentary rules. 4-minute limits on answers, 45-second limits on questions, and question time itself to last no longer than 90 minutes. Annabel, how did it go?
Well, it certainly was a speedy affair. We were done and dusted by about 3:15, or no, 3:22 it was, which is almost unheard of under the old regime. And most of the ministers seemed to have no trouble keeping to the 4-minute limits. There was a great moment actually where Wayne Swan managed to round off very elegantly with 2 seconds left on the clock and got a bit of a golf clap, you know, until the Speaker ruined everything by announcing that in fact they had buggered up the clock and that Wayne Swan had actually spoken for just over 5 minutes, so 5 seconds. 5 minutes, I'm sorry. Apart from the dysfunctional clock, it all went fine. I thought that the major test for this new shortened format was always going to be when the Foreign Minister of Australia got a question, and he managed to conform very nicely to the format. So, yeah, it was pretty well behaved too on the whole, and that may be because of this sort of kinder, gentler polity. I think it's probably because no side of Parliament now, no major party can afford to lose even one MP for being thrown out for bad behaviour. As a result, it was a reasonably civil sort of hour and a half. Which gives the
new Speaker, or the continuing Speaker, Harry Jenkins, a hell of a lot of power, doesn't it? Because if he throws people out, suddenly those votes will change radically.
Well, that's right, and I think that everybody's testing their way in this new environment. I think that whereas in the old Parliament you would see people getting thrown out almost recreationally from time to time, you'd have some MPs even on Thursday afternoons who would often get thrown out, I thought sometimes a tiny bit intentionally, because early detention equals early minute equals home for tea, but that's not happening anymore. And I think you'll find that Harry Jenkins will think very carefully about throwing people out too. There are different levels of expulsion you can have in the House. For the worst offences, you get thrown out for a number of days, and for the lighter offences, you can get thrown out for a number of hours. I think that Harry Jenkins will be thinking pretty carefully before he chucks people out, but I think that people will be behaving better too as a rule.
James, what did you think of the first question time under the new rules?
Well, look, I did catch a bit of the question time, and I have to say I wasn't particularly surprised. We had Dorothy Dixes from ALP backbenchers to government ministers. We had Kevin Rudd droning on like usual, and we had partisan bickering between the opposition and the government. So it seemed to me more or less like business as usual. But I have to say, I don't think the Australian people are going to be rejoicing tonight that question time is moderately less archaic than it used to be. This is just a classic inside the Beltway issue that doesn't really impact on the lives of most Australians, and I think it's been given plenty of airtime already.
Scott, what was your take on today's proceedings?
Look, the thing that was just running through my mind throughout was Freud's great theory about the return of the repressed. As soon as you've got the formalities in place that try to keep certain types of behaviour in place, or at least give them a kind of veneer of civility, when they return, they're going to return with a kind of vengeance. And it just felt throughout that there's this kind of simmering brutality that's just about to lurch onto the parliamentary floor. But I must say that the thing today, which probably, to my mind, didn't bode terribly well, it doesn't bode well for Tony Abbott, was Rob Oakeshot's question, which
seemed like a Dorothy Dixer itself, didn't it? It seemed like it came straight from was written by maybe Anthony Albanese.
It really did. It was a soft pitch. It was a fairly easy one to the government, but I think what that indicated fairly clearly is that the independent crossbenchers are not impressed at all with the coalition's behaviour to date, and there may be some kind of backlash to what would be regarded as Tony Abbott's obstructionism.
But even if they're not impressed by Tony Abbott's so-called obstructionism, surely it's their job to hold the government account via their electorate, on the grounds of their electorate. And ask a tough question about government policy.
You would think that, but again, my impression in these very early stages is that they're walking very lightly indeed, because as we saw in the final stages of the deliberations between Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott and Julia Gillard, this is their moment in the sun. They don't want anything. They don't want to do anything that's going to put the government offside or that's going to jeopardise their own place of relative privilege.
Annabel, James brought up the issue of Dorothy Dix's. We've got Dorothy Dix's still, and
yes.
you know, we get these questions. So, what is the state of the economy? Please tell us, Treasurer.
No, it tends to be rather more clumsily phrased than that. Typically, some poor beleaguered backbencher will pop up and demand that the Treasurer update the House on the economic climate or something like that.
Why do the independents not campaign to get rid of that, Annabel?
I would campaign, I would do almost anything. I would die in the cause of campaigning to abolish the term update the House. I just don't want to be updated anymore. Look, Dorothy Dix's have always been lame. They continue to be lame. I always wonder why it is that we even ask ministers to front up and answer them in person. I'd be very happy to accept a written, tabled answer. Half the time they're written out in advance anyway, and ministers read them out, although currently the speakers, the new rules and standing orders do oblige ministers to speak without notes as much as they possibly can. So we'll see how that one pans out. But yes, I could do with fewer Dorothy Dix's. I thought that Rob Oakeshott's question was pretty soft, but I wouldn't. Look, I think we need to see how this runs in the medium term. I mean, don't forget that Rob Oakeshott was, when he stood up to deliver that slightly gentle ball at the government, he was really only 2 hours down the track from having voted against the government in a motion and defeating the government on the floor of the House, which is an extremely unusual event in Parliament. So he's not going to be voting for them all the time. I think that's becoming pretty clear.
OK, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt on the first question. But Annabel, a significant development today was that a government lost a vote on the floor of the House of Reps for the first time since 1941.
Yes, well, this is one that's strictly for the nerd hardcore, and there's been a bit of the opposition was text messaging and trumpeting straight away as soon as it won this vote on the floor of the House that it was the first time it had happened since 1941. There have been several instances since where speakers have used casting votes to favour the opposition in procedural motions and so on. So there's a rich picking this afternoon for procedural nerds to argue back and forth just how significant this is. I don't think anyone is suggesting that it's a par for the course. This is certainly a major development, and I think it'll be the first of many votes that go in another way from the way the government would like it to. But the matter in question, in case anyone's interested, was a detail of the standing orders that the parties have negotiated between themselves in that famous group hug agreement between Labor, Liberal and the two independents, Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor. And the clause that they disagreed about was a clause that I call the Mulligan clause. I'm borrowing a term from the golfing world there. It's that slight loophole among casual golfing partners where if you really mess up a shot, you're allowed to take it again. And similarly, in this new Parliament, the parties have agreed that if a member of the House is absent from a division or a vote through inadvertence or getting caught up or missing the vote or not hearing the bells or being stuck in the loo or something similar, that they're allowed to recommit the vote. The parties are agreed on that, but the disagreement was that the coalition wants, if a vote is recommitted, for there to be a debate in the Parliament first before the vote is restaged. This gives the opportunity to the opposition to point the finger at, mock, laugh at and otherwise excoriate the poor idiot who missed the vote in the first place.
Okay.
The government wanted it just to be automatic. So the coalition's prevailed on that point with the support of the independents. Sorry for going on there.
No,
Too
that's
much
okay.
detail,
That's a great
probably.
explanation of Mulligan's Law, and we'll know a lot more about it in the next few weeks. And the first question that was asked in question time today said a lot about the way the opposition will attack the Gillard government.
Can the Prime Minister advise the House of the cost of living impact on Australian families of a $40 a tonne carbon price?
And the opposition's second question was directed at the Treasurer, also about a carbon price. Scott, is this tactically the right move for Tony Abbott to be making, do you think?
I don't see how he can really go anywhere else apart from on this very point. Although, to be frank, it's also a little bit disingenuous to say we made the various commitments before the election. We've made various commitments before the government was in fact formed. When he himself has left himself open, if you like, to criticism that he's also just recently walked away from an agreement, and this time an agreement in writing. I think the reality of the situation is whatever was said during the campaign, and Julie Gillard pretty much admitted this last week. I mean, all bets are now off. This is a new situation. I'm not sure about a new paradigm, but this is a new environment, and at the moment they really have to strive for whatever advantage they can get. And for Gillard at the moment, it's trying to draw as close as she can to the
James, I take it you don't agree with that analysis?
Yeah, I have to strongly disagree with Scott's analysis here. Julia Gillard is trying to, in effect, use the hung parliament as a get-out-of-jail-free card, as a way of saying, oh, all these promises I made in the election, they can't really be adhered to. It's not my fault. I'd love to implement them, but I can't. She was crystal clear on a carbon tax before the election. You can all look it up on YouTube. The footage is there. She said we will not have a carbon tax. And there was no ifs, buts, maybes. There was no, it might go to a committee, the committee might report back. It was crystal clear, and she's failed to repeat that since the election. And what that demonstrates is real bad faith on the part of the Prime Minister to adhering to her election promises, and I think it's a sign of things to come.
What if more and more businesses come out and business leaders come out and say they're in favour of a price on carbon? Does that have the potential to isolate Tony Abbott on this issue?
It may or may not, but business leaders saying one thing or other does not absolve the Prime Minister from an election promise that she made. I mean, this could be Julia Gillard's non-core promise, and I think it will haunt her for a long time if the ALP does go down the road of a carbon tax. Yeah,
but I'm curious about Tony Abbott's position on this, because the business community is his traditional constituency. If they keep pushing towards a carbon price, and we're seeing some leaders come out post-election, like Marius Kloppers, and saying that, will it put more pressure on him to move towards that political position as well?
Yeah, well, I'm not a BHP shareholder, but I don't know how happy I'd be with Marius Kloppers if I was one. I think Marius was not speaking in the interest of his company or of the business community generally, and I think the business community is actually quite clear on this. If you look at the leading business organisations like ACCI, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, they're saying, well, we need to wait on this. Let's see what happens in the United States. Let's see what happens in China. There is no need for Australia to go ahead of the rest of the world, and that is perfectly in line with Tony Abbott's position.
Annabel, what do you think?
Well, I thought that Julia Gillard's initial answer during the campaign on that carbon tax question was pretty disingenuous, and I think that her explanation of changing it since has been pretty disingenuous too. She's she said that circumstances have changed. Well, I don't think they've changed that much, I think that the Greens were always going to hold the balance of power in the Senate. I mean, it seemed pretty clear that that was going to happen beforehand, and so her attempt to sort of redefine it now I think indicates just how sort of freaked out over the course of the campaign the government was about this particular issue. I think that she answered it badly during the campaign.
Yeah, that did seem to be a mistake. And let's move on and talk about another issue. And a delegation of Indigenous leaders visited Canberra today to lobby against Tony Abbott's plan to try and overturn Queensland's Wild Rivers Act. Traditional owner David Cloudy disagrees with the views of the opposition leader. He says overturning the legislation will open the door to large-scale mining projects, damage the environment and also put Indigenous eco-businesses at risk.
Wild Rivers is about conservation, environmental and Indigenous rights in terms of our livelihoods, our autonomy, and it creates employment for us to compete with the western side of things. So what we are afraid of, if they're gonna overturn the Wild Rivers Bill, well then we won't have that opportunity.
But Cape York Indigenous leader Noel Pearson says a new report by the Anglican Church released today proves the Queensland government is wrong about the economic impact of its Wild Rivers laws.
Yes, there is a bigger picture in relation to the environment, but there's also a big picture about Aboriginal development, poverty, suffering, and the need for people to develop an economic base.